I'm Kaden Love,
And I'm Seema Love, his wife.
and we are Love and Lore, bringing dark fantasy, light fantasy, and everything in between. And we are talking about love today.
Some of you probably already know, but Kaden wrote a book series called Paladins of the Harvest. Elegy of Fragmented Vineyard came out early 2024, and second book is coming out in 2025. And I was one of his beta readers and ARC readers and whatever, and I had a lot of critiques about the way he wrote romance. And whenever he finishes a book, I always read it, and I always have something to say about the way he wrote romance because I read a lot of romance books. So today we want to talk about that. What makes a good romance, in my opinion, in a fantasy book, and all the things I told Kaden. And also, not to say that I'm like the romance professional and I know everything, and I'm not even an author, but I do have my opinions.
And it's been really fun because out of the books that I've written and published, Elegy has a very slow start to a romance. Beast Call doesn't have any romance, and Duet of Pernicious Eels, I really try to hammer through the seeds that I was planting in book one. And I also have an unpublished book that we're not going to get too much into, but Seema has read it, and that one has romance as a big primary theme. And it was interesting to see my evolution as I was going along. I think I made some good wins along the way, because I think the third installation in that unpublished book was my best one, but there were still things that she was like, okay, you need to do this, and this here. And overall, this discussion is going to pertain to romance in fantasy, because that's what I write. I don't write romantasy or sci-fantasy. Those definitely are more of a genre in their own. And I've heard people explain it as romantasy being romance, the primary theme and plot point, and then adding on to it, whereas we're going to be focusing on romance as a theme in books, just in fantasy and sci-fi not being the central theme.
And even though I love romance in my fantasy books, I don't necessarily read just romance books. I only read them in a context of, a bigger conflict. And my opinion, and that's rule number one for good romance, in my opinion, in a fantasy book, is that it has to be interconnected with the main conflict, and it has to be a part of the resolution. It doesn't have to be the resolution of the conflict, but I like it when, things turned out the way they turned out because someone loved someone, kind of thing.
And I think that that's something you helped me recognize too, that it is definitely, there's a purpose behind it. You can tell when relationships are just kind of forced, and I think it is those successful relationships are the ones that are tied to the plot. The closest thing I've read to romantasy is probably the Cruel Prince and the following books, which I wouldn't even say is romantasy. I would say it is court intrigue fantasy with a very heavy focus on romance, and the romance in that is completely tied to the plot. The only reason it really comes about is because what our main character has to do in the political system in the world.
And the interesting thing is that even though I was the one who told Kaden to read Cruel Prince trilogy, I wasn't necessarily the fan of the romance in the Cruel Prince. It wasn't my favorite. Speaking of my favorites that you asked me about, I do think that two books that come to mind is Name of the Wind and Dance of Thieves. One being a good example of a romance that is slow burn, or Dance of Thieves is an example of they got together pretty early on, and then there are like conflicts, and they get together, and then split apart. So like these kind of things. I think both of these are good examples, and both of these need to be done a little bit differently, and I guess we'll talk about both today.
So one of the difficult things, I think, is length of book. The third unnamed book that I wrote, the romance definitely just kind of really begins and occurs in one book, whereas we have in Duet of Pernicious Eels is when the romance finally pays off. If you look at the Stormlight Archive or Wheel of Time, there are ones that are seeds sown early on, but the romance doesn't happen till later. So what would you give as advice for romantic pacing? What do you think needs to happen? What are some things that makes it feel rushed or too slow? We can look at Stormlight Archive or Wheel of Time, where things are set up early on but don't pay off until later, and that's kind of what I was going for with Elegy and Duet. But the third unpublished book that I wrote, it's completely unrelated to those, and I tried to encapsulate the romance in that book on its own to be kind of something that continues on in following books. And so what were some of your critiques there?
I think that's a good example of pacing. I loved like the chemistry set up for the characters in that book, but I did think that it happened way too fast. And I don't think it's the problem necessarily on like, oh, in the timeline it's just like this amount of days, not enough. It was more that not enough interactions between the characters happened in order for them to reach to that kind of relationship. I think one of the suggestions I gave you with that book, and I usually don't give Kaden like very specific suggestions, but I was pretty proud of myself for coming up with something good. I was like, okay, I want them to have a conversation when he asks her something, not like what's your favorite color kind of, but just like a question that is directed to just get to know her better. At that point your characters didn't have like they only talked about like, okay, we need to do this, that, because it was action packed. And they didn't have time to really get to know each other, and I really wanted that to happen before they got together. So I would say, to sum it up, second rule of good romantasy, they gotta have at least one heartfelt conversation, at least ask at least one question, trying to get to know each other, and just like have a couple of these building moments.
And now let's talk about tropes. One of the hottest phrases out on Book Talk especially is the enemies to lovers, which I think was kind of done in The Cruel Prince and the following books. And honestly, the romance wasn't my favorite in there as well. I think in the end, I enjoyed how it was done, but it definitely seemed like she was really trying to bank on the enemies to lovers thing. And neither of us have read Fourth Wing, but I've heard that goes really hard on that trope. So rather than just enemies to lovers, what are some tropes that you like to see, or are you a fan of just completely their own take?
Well, I feel like conversation about tropes is a really big one, and there are so many of them out there. But I do have my favorites, and I feel like people in general, girls in general, have their favorites. One of my personal favorites is one of them gets hurt, the other one has to take care of them. I don't know, I just like, it's kind of cute. And it's not necessarily enemies to lovers trope that I love. I think it's the part of it that a person has to completely reassess how they see another person. And I feel like it's a very dynamic, it's a lot of development in a relationship going from here to here. And I just like to see it. But I do think that tropes are important, especially to authors who usually don't write romance, because I can see how someone, for example, you, who for you it's more like action is important and plot is important, and you don't usually pay as much attention to romance. I think for you it's important to do these tropes, because sometimes if you're like not a skilled author in romance, I can see how writing romance can turn out pretty bland if you don't put something like that in there. But that's just my opinion. I think tropes are good.
And an interesting critique, we mentioned this in our Name of the Wind video, that a lot of people have a problem with Kvothe being a Gary Sue, that he gets any girl that he wants or things like that. And so how can you, I guess, what are some things you think that authors should avoid, just to make it seem like, their character isn't getting all they want and things like that? Like in that book that I wrote, I have a character who has gone through struggles and another character who is in a more vulnerable position, and I really had to work around that, making it seem like one person isn't taking advantage of the other. I guess, what was it that you liked about Denna and Kvothe in Name of the Wind, where you saw as more natural and not Gary Sue?
I think why it worked and why I don't mind the Gary Sue-ness in Name of the Wind is he didn't get the girl right away. She wasn't blown away by him. She didn't crawl to him. The Name of the Wind is a really slow burn, and I think that's what makes it work. And I think that's a critique that I gave you for your third unnamed book. There was a character and a girl, and I think she was out of his league, and she was the first one who made a move, which I thought made it a little bit Gary Sue-ish. If the love interest is out of the main character's league, they shouldn't be the one to make the move first, even though it can be done if it's done really well. But since your book was so short, I don't think you had enough time to create this like interesting, oh, how did she fall for him kind of trope. So that's one critique that I gave to him. I was like, okay, he gotta be the first one to make the move, and he gotta be the one to, try and reach her.
It's interesting to kind of overplay some of these dynamics that we're familiar with in our world, in this case in a science fiction setting, sometimes in a fantasy setting. And I'm really excited for you to get to the Stormlight Archive, even though I say this all the time, because this is a dynamic where we get to see this across different age groups. You get to see younger love amongst people like our age, but you get to see some adults going for it too, where it's kind of that will they, won't they. And so I think there's so many different ways to do it. I guess you just have to get others' opinions if you're writing it. That is how the world works. Nobody's romance is the same, and to have multiple eyes on it to make it feel genuine in a book is the way that you're going to make your readers really enjoy it. Because it seems like everybody's looking for different things. I think I look for something different than you do, probably, and I think that someone that is reading pure romantasy is probably going for something a little different than both of us are going for.
Yeah, totally. I feel like the styles are different, and I think an interesting thing I noticed in your books, whenever I read Kaden's books, I always see that he's very careful. He's like, oh, please don't let this be cringy, and he's like so careful to not make this cringy. I think it's so cute because, I feel like in harder fantasy, there is a different level of cringe that you cannot cross compared to like YA romantasy that I usually read.
And I think honestly, just if you're a reader, this is something great to look out for. There's so many different options, and a lot of people can be turned off from books because they might see that romance is a big thing. Yes, The Cruel Prince is not for everyone, but I think it would appeal to a lot more people than that might see it as just but I think it might appeal to a lot more people because many people might think that it's romantasy. And one of my recent great indie reads this year was Earthbound by Katie Stein. Really excited for Seema to get into this, because this was a great epic science fantasy, but it had romance as a very pivotal driving point here. But that was not the whole point of the book. It just added a lot of tension. So I think that readers really need to, if they are turned away from books with romance being a big thing, just as with any plot points or plot devices, just give things a chance. And for authors looking to implement romance out there, there are so many great examples and just as many terrible examples. And Stephen King said in On Writing, one of the greatest writing books on writing, he talks about how you can learn just as much from poorly written examples as you can from great things. One of the things I didn't like about The Wheel of Time was Rand and his 3 women that just kind of loved him, even though there were points where it got better. There were a lot of things that I learned from that, as well as reading more YA books that kind of have cringy bits of romance. You can learn what to not do if you're writing to an adult audience. And there's no one solid way to do it, but there are ways definitely to do it better.
And speaking of great and bad examples, what are some of your favorite romances in fantasy, and what are some of the worst that you've read? Let us know. I would love to hear people's opinion, and I would love to hear your opinion on what I thought about romance and fantasy, so let us know, and thank you for watching.